I was home by myself. My parents and sister were not at home. I had just recently gotten out of the hospital for a surgery, but that's not the reason I was by myself. I just liked having the house to myself and actually spent a lot of time alone in my bedroom. I was actually feeling a bit pissed off because my sister had eaten all of the ice cream without telling anyone. That was something that always really annoyed me about her. She ate so much, so whenever I wanted something, it would just not be there. That happened with quite a lot of things. If I wanted anything to myself, I would normally have to get my hands on it and hide it away. Nothing could be savored. So there I was, sitting in the house, wondering what I should do to entertain myself. I tended to spend a lot of time in my room, but for some reason this time, I decided to hang out in the living room because no one else was home. As I was sitting there, though, I suddenly noticed something that I could not explain. There was something that was catching my eye up on the ceiling. At first, I thought it might be my imagination or something. When I looked over to the corner of the room that had suddenly caught my attention, I could see that there was nothing there. I decided to pass it off and took out a book to read. After a couple of more times while I was reading the book, though, the same thing continued to happen, and it began to get on my nerves. Something kept drawing my attention away, but it kept vanishing before I could get a chance to find out what it was. I did the only thing I could figure to do. I stopped reading, and then I just watched that corner of the ceiling that kept catching my eye's attention. I figured that maybe it was a bug or something crawling around, and this time when I caught it, my curiosity would be satisfied and I would be able to pay attention to my book a lot easier. Finally, though, after looking at it for a few minutes, I did notice what was catching my eye. I was wrong about my curiosity being satisfied, though. In fact, things just got a whole lot stranger. What I was seeing, I did not have any explanation for. There was this weird orange light that was popping up on the ceiling. It would only be there for a few moments, and then it would disappear right away. I continued to look at that spot, and at regular intervals the light would come back and then go away suddenly again. I had no idea what it was, so I looked around to see if there could be a source for the light that kept coming and going. I couldn't find anything, at least in my field of view, though. Even if I could have, I wonder if it would have explained why the light had suddenly switched spots. It had been in the corner of the ceiling the entire time, but suddenly, for the first time, it was on the other side, sort of by the kitchen door. As the light moved from the one corner, and I followed it to the other, I suddenly saw something that was much more frightening. I could see someone walking through the kitchen. The unmistakable shadow of a person on the kitchen wall. The orange light had moved over to the corner of the ceiling above the kitchen door, so I was looking straight on at the shadow when I saw it. I called out for my parents and my sister, although I knew it could not be one of them. I would have heard them and seen them when they came home. They would have come through the living room, which I had just been sitting in. There was of course no answer, so I went and grabbed a knife out of the chopping block in the kitchen. Then I went and walked through the entire house doing a thorough check. I checked all of the doors, all of the windows, and found all of them locked. I also checked all of the rooms and closets, but I could find no one in the house. I was still very unsettled, though. I returned to the living room and remained on the couch, keeping an eye out until my family finally returned home. After they did, though, I didn't see either the orange light or the human shadow ever again. This happened 2 summers ago. I worked at a job where I was on the road a lot, so I found myself often in some pretty interesting places. Here's what I witnessed this particular day. One hot summer afternoon a few years ago, I was working a job where I drove from store to store setting up the displays. I finished at one location and started driving to the next, but I decided to stop at Trader Joe's for some groceries first. I pulled into the parking lot and parked on the perimeter next to a tree for shade. and also to avoid the clusterfuck of parking lot antics. I turned off my truck and decided to quickly check my phone for messages. After a few moments, though, I suddenly heard gunfire. It sounded so close, I ducked down immediately. I was parked where cars drove through the lot to get to Starbucks, Arby's, and a few other stores. The stores were between me and the highway that ran through the city. I heard a few more shots ring out, and they sounded closer this time. I looked up over the dashboard to see if I either needed to get out of there or if I was safer to just not move at all. When I looked up, I saw a young man in his 20s or 30s running across the highway in a reddish full-length fur coat, carrying a gun. I had to just stare for a moment. I couldn't register exactly what I was seeing. A man running with a 9mm is alarming enough, but it was so strange to see him wearing a fur coat on a hot summer day. I was completely perplexed. After he crossed the road, he darted behind the Starbucks. I heard more shots, then I saw him ducking behind the bushes between the Starbucks and Arby's. I called 911 and explained where the shooter was. Just then, a car with 2 people inside drove past me in the direction of the shooter, apparently unaware of the situation. As they drove towards Arby's, the man in the fur coat stepped out from behind the bushes and blocked the car in the road. He pointed the gun at the driver's head and told them to get out. He jacked their vehicle and started for the next lot. By that time, there were so many cops, SWAT, detectives, and fire trucks in the area that no one could leave. I watched as the officers put on their bulletproof vests while finagling their weapons as they ran closer to the scene. The shooter must have been surrounded by then if they were confident enough to get out of their vehicles and knew the shooter wouldn't get much further, so I jumped out of my truck as well. Okay, so yes, I'm a bit embarrassed that my primitive looky-loo trait kicked in. But exactly how often do you get to see this thing go down in front of you? I walked towards the parking lot beyond Arby's. As I got closer, I saw a sniper laying across the bed of a truck, and probably almost 90 officers, men and women. It was intense to see this much force. It was strategic but cautious. Information was traveling quickly, and I heard that everyone in Ross and the other businesses were notified by phone to go into lockdown and move all of their customers and clients to the back of their establishment, away from the windows. Surprisingly, I was able to walk quite close to the area and see that the man in the fur coat had driven up over a curb and was teetering high on a bush, unable to flee. At that point, there were negotiators getting in contact with him. Police finally created a better perimeter and pushed back the curious and nosy, so I left. The next day, I decided to Google more details and see what had actually happened. It was quite a sad story. The man with the gun had a 2-year-old boy who lived with the boy's mother and her new boyfriend. 3 days before the shooting had taken place, the boyfriend had beaten the little boy to death. The shooter was so distraught over the loss of his son that he felt he had nothing to lose. One man was shot in the alley before he crossed the highway to Starbucks. He fired again into Arby's, sending everyone inside scrambling to the floor. From what I understand, though, the guy in the alley was the only one that got hit. The negotiator had talked to the shooter while he was still high-tailed up on the shrubbery and promised him help and assistance through the system if he would surrender. They offered him a beer, some time to drink it, and time to calm down before he surrendered, and in the end they did. I hope that they delivered to the shooter what they promised. It doesn't make it okay to go out shooting up a city, but it does give a window into what people go through and what happens when there's nobody to turn to or nothing to lose. It was snowing, and it was snowing hard. I was very unhappy too. I worked at a Wendy's that was about 5 miles away from my home, and I tended to walk. The worst times were walking in the rain or snow. But the snow was often the worst because it caused all sorts of problems. I was working on the grill in the afternoon. As I was working, when I could leave the grill for a few moments, I would go over and take a look out the back drive-thru window. The snow was falling heavily, and it was sticking. I knew it was going to be a very awful walk home. I got off at 6 p.m., but this was in December, so it was already dark out and had been for a couple of hours. I didn't have anyone I could ask for a ride, so I tried my best to tough it out and just walk home. At first, it was fine, because the parking lots of the shopping area were salted, and the snow there wasn't that bad. But when I got past the point there were any sidewalks left, that was when it got really difficult. With the severity of the snowstorm, there were not a whole lot of cars out on the road. When they did come, they threw slush all over the place. I would have to try to step away from the road as much as I could to not get covered with all that gunk. And this went on for a while as I was walking. Having the snow smack against my face was beginning to sting a bit. And that was when something happened. There was another car coming down the road. When I moved out of the way, though, I watched as the car came to a stop. The window from the passenger side rolled down. It was dark in the car and I couldn't really see who was driving, but I moved closer to it. "Hey, would you like a ride?" A male voice came out of the darkness. I told him that I was pretty wet, so I didn't want to get his car wet too, but he insisted that it would be fine. He again offered the ride. Well, I decided I really wanted to get out of that snow, so I accepted. I opened the door and was about to get in the car, but when I was halfway into it, another car began coming down the road. There was a sudden flash of light. I noticed two things immediately in that light. One, the guy was holding a knife in his hand, and it was up against the seat, and his pants were unzipped. There was something else he had a hand by as well. I stumbled backward and fell into the snow. I yelled at the huge SUV that was driving by. It was the one that had the lights that had revealed what the guy in the car was doing. The man in the car didn't hesitate at all. He slammed the door and drove off as quickly as possible despite the snow. The SUV quickly stopped and asked me what was going on. I explained, and they offered graciously to take me to the police. I didn't think it would do anything, but I supposed I had an obligation to make a statement, so they knew someone was driving around doing something like that. After that, the cop drove me home safely, so I guess in the end I did get a ride. This story takes place 10 years ago, when I was just 16, and for almost that long I've wanted to tell it. I'm 25 now, and a female I should note. It surely won't be as terrifying as the best of the best, but I still think it's a strong contender. It's played on my mind ever since it happened, if that's anything to go by. I guess we'll find out now, though. When I was in high school, I babysat on the odd occasion for a family I'd known since I was very young. They were great, really laid back. Honestly, it was the easiest babysitting job in the entire world, because the kids would usually already be in bed before I got there, and they always slept really well. It had been about a year since I'd babysat for them, and in that time they'd had a new baby, who was about 6 months old. So on this occasion, it was me, 3 kids downstairs, and 1 baby resting peacefully upstairs. I should really mention before anything that their house was completely amazing. It wasn't the flashiest or anything, but it was pretty huge. Although it was in a suburban street, it was positioned on a hill so that from the master bedroom upstairs, you could look out over the whole city. They also had tons of CDs, which back then was a really exciting thing. The kitchen was always full, and the whole place was decorated like a gallery. Amazing art, brilliantly designed and really spacious, that sort of thing. They always had interesting stuff around too. That night, I noticed in the front room amongst the kids' stuff, there was a fake samurai sword. I remember laughing at it, thinking it looked too real to just be a toy, and waving it around a bit. It didn't surprise me. They were interesting people, and I was always finding things that I liked whenever I visited them. The layout of the house was very cool too. The front door opened almost directly into the living room, and off to the side we had the 2 kids' bedrooms, then a staircase leading upstairs to the parents' room. The living room was fantastic, with giant windows overlooking the front garden and almost the entire street in front of it. The middle part of the house was completely open plan, with the kitchen and dining room spread out for what seemed like miles. Near the back of the house, they even had a small study, which was more like a little reading nook. From memory, it was just an armchair and 2 walls of books. That part is important, because the night this happened, that's where I just happened to be hanging out. I'd been dropped off by my parents at around 8:30, and the mom and dad left soon after, telling me the kids were fast asleep, and that if I had any problems with the baby, I could wake their eldest daughter who was good at settling him, and she would help me if I needed it. I was really comforted by that because I knew virtually nothing about babies. I didn't need to in the end though, because the kids slept fine. The most important thing is though, I felt safe, at ease. They told me they would be back at around 1 a.m. and to call them right away if I needed anything. I wasn't particularly worried. I'd done this routine countless times before, and even though it was a cold night with a harsh wind, I knew this house like the back of my hand. I knew the kids would sleep. I knew nothing would happen. I felt almost like it was my own home. I felt so safe, in fact, that when I had trouble locking the screen door after they'd gone, I didn't stress too much about it. I thought maybe it was jammed or something. I didn't have a key to the front door, and usually the screen door shut just fine. They lived in a good neighborhood though, and it didn't occur to me at the time that it was anything to worry about. I quickly forgot about it and went to the study to read after checking in on the kids occasionally. After that though, I lost track of time for a while. I didn't have a mobile phone when I was 16, and there was no clock within the reading nook. I was totally lost within a book, and before I knew it, a couple of hours had already gone by. But it wasn't realizing the time that woke me up from my reading stupor. It was nothing at all, and that's what was so frightening. I'd been deep in the book, and then all of a sudden I looked up and felt such a strong sense of dread. Suddenly everything seemed more quiet, but then I heard the wind. An unease and fear washed over me, so much so that I felt reluctant to move and look. I didn't understand. I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. I thought as I stared at the books on the walls that maybe I'd just been sitting there for too long. So I got up and slowly wandered into the kitchen with the intent of checking on the kids and then maybe watching some TV. The front living room was in darkness, and as I stepped into it on my way to the bedrooms, something stopped me dead in my tracks. Within the light of the kitchen illuminating me from behind, I stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of a man standing in the front garden. He didn't move, and I didn't either. I could see that he had shut the garden gate tight behind him, and from his position in the garden, it was clear he'd been walking towards the front door that was unlocked. I didn't know what to do. A million thoughts overwhelmed me. I had no weapon, and the door was open. I couldn't get to the kids downstairs and the baby upstairs at the same time. The man was huge, and I was small. I was lit up, and he was covered by darkness, dressed all in black. I've never seen anything more terrifying in my entire life. I knew if I didn't do something, he would come inside and get us. But then out of the corner of my eye, I spotted that fake samurai sword, and very slowly, bending down slightly but not taking my eyes off the figure in the garden, I picked it up and raised it in the air above my head. I don't know why. I couldn't think of anything else in the moment. After what seemed like an eternity, he looked at the sword, then turned and slowly walked towards the gate, opened it, and walked away down the street. It was only then that I saw the glint of something at his side, something he'd hidden in one hand as he'd stood there staring into the house. I stood there for a long time just watching him walk away. Then I ran to the front door and leaned against it, forcing it shut against an intruder that was no longer there. I was 16, and I know this is stupid, but I never called anyone. I stayed that way until the parents got home, and I never told them what happened. I never told anyone for a long time. I thought that everyone would just blame me and pile on me for putting the kids in danger, and then I managed to convince myself that it was nothing, and maybe I'd overreacted. The family today are fine and well, and nothing ever happened to them or their house after that night, but I've always been thankful for that moment of intense dread that just so happened to cause me to leave the study, because if I hadn't, I don't even let myself think how differently that night would have gone. So, for the man in the garden, I hope the fake sword was enough to scare you away from lurking outside people's houses in the night, and I hope we never meet again.